If someone had told me that a simple letter could turn my entire world upside down, I would have laughed in their face. I would have said they were being dramatic, that they watched too many movies. But here I am, sitting in my kitchen at 2, in the morning, staring at a piece of paper that has shattered everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, about the woman who raised me. Everything I believed to be true has crumbled like sand between my fingers, and I don't know if I'll ever feel solid ground beneath my feet again. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I discovered that my entire life was built on a lie, so carefully constructed, so meticulously maintained, that it took 32 years for a single crack to appear. But when that crack finally showed itself, everything came tumbling down with a force that left me gasping for air, questioning, not just who I am, but who I've always been. 3 weeks ago, I was just another person going through the motions of daily life. I had my routines, my job at the marketing firm, my small apartment with the plants I somehow managed to keep alive, and the quiet satisfaction of a life that felt predictable and safe. I thought I knew my story. I thought I understood where I came from, even if the details had always felt a little blurry around the edges, a little too carefully curated. But that's getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because the beginning is where the lies started too. I grew up in a house where silence was more common than laughter, where embraces were reserved for special occasions, and where questions about the past were met with tight smiles and swift changes of subject. My mother, Linda, was a woman who believed in control above all else. She controlled what we ate, when we ate it, what we watched on television, who we talked to, and most importantly, what we talked about. My father, the man I called Dad for 32 years, was quieter, gentler, but ultimately passive in the face of my mother's iron will. He would sometimes catch my eye when she was being particularly rigid, and I'd see something there, something that looked almost like an apology, but he never spoke up. He never challenged her. He never asked why. Looking back now, with the clarity that only comes from having your world torn apart and rebuilt, I can see all the signs that something wasn't quite right. But as a child, you don't question the world you're given. You assume that every family operates like yours, that every mother keeps photo albums locked away in the highest shelf of the closet, that every father looks uncomfortable when relatives visit and start telling stories about the old days. There were always these little moments, these tiny fractures in the perfect facade my mother worked so hard to maintain. Like the time my aunt mentioned someone named David at a family gathering, and the way my mother's face went completely white before she quickly steered the conversation elsewhere. Or the way certain family friends would look at me with this strange expression, as if they were seeing someone else entirely when they looked into my eyes. I remember asking my mother once why I looked so different from both of them, why my eyes were green when theirs were brown, why my hair had this reddish tint that neither of them possessed. She told me I took after my grandmother on her side, the one who died when I was too young to remember her. It seemed reasonable enough. Children don't usually question these things too deeply, but there were other things too, things that didn't make sense even to my young mind. Like the way my mother would sometimes catch herself before saying certain names, as if she had to constantly monitor her own words to avoid revealing something she shouldn't. Or the way she would get this faraway look in her eyes sometimes, especially when she thought no one was watching, as if she was remembering something that caused her pain. And then there were the phone calls, the ones she would take in another room with the door closed, speaking in hushed tones that always ended abruptly when I came near. I learned early not to push too hard for answers. My mother had a way of shutting down conversations that made it clear that certain topics were not open for discussion. She would get this cold, distant look, and the temperature in the room would drop by 10 degrees. So I stopped asking about the gaps in our family photos, stopped wondering why we never visited certain relatives, stopped questioning why some stories seemed to have missing pieces. I told myself that every family had their secrets, their private corners that children weren't meant to explore. As I got older, the feeling that something was off only grew stronger. In high school, when we had to do those family tree projects, I struggled to fill in the branches. My mother would give me vague answers about distant relatives, always seeming slightly uncomfortable with the questions. When I asked to see more family photos for the project, She told me most of them had been lost in a flood years before I was born. It was always something like that, always a convenient explanation that shut down further inquiry. College provided some distance from the constant feeling of walking on eggshells. But even then, when I would call home, there was always this undercurrent of tension, as if my mother was constantly afraid I might ask the wrong question or stumble upon the wrong piece of information. She would ask about my classes, my friends, my grades, but she never really wanted to know about my life. It was more like she was checking boxes, making sure I was staying within the boundaries she had set for me, even from hundreds of miles away. After graduation, I moved back home for a few months while I job hunted, and that's when I really started to notice how carefully orchestrated our family life was. My mother controlled the mail, always getting to it before anyone else. She screened phone calls, often not mentioning when people had called for me until days later, if at all. She kept the important documents, birth certificates, insurance, papers, all locked away in a file cabinet that she claimed was for organisation, but felt more like a fortress protecting state secrets. The man I called Dad seemed to grow more distant over the years, more withdrawn. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, something between sadness and guilt. When I asked him about it, he would just shake his head and change the subject. He started spending more time in his workshop, in the garage, tinkering with old radios and clocks, anything that gave him a reason to be away from the house and away from the weight of whatever secret was pressing down on all of us. I moved out as soon as I found a stable job, partly for independence, but mostly because the atmosphere in that house had become suffocating. Even then, my mother would call constantly, always wanting to know where I was, who I was with, what I was doing. She had this way of making her concern feel more like surveillance, as if she was constantly worried that I might discover something I wasn't supposed to know. Years passed like this, with me living my life, but always feeling like there was something just out of reach, some truth that hovered at the edges of my consciousness, but never quite came into focus. I dated, I worked, I built friendships and tried to create the kind of warm, open relationships that I had never experienced at home. But there was always this nagging feeling that I was performing a role rather than living authentically, that some essential part of my identity was missing or hidden, even from myself. And then my grandmother died. My father's mother, the one person in our extended family who had always seemed to see right through my mother's carefully constructed barriers. She was 93 and had been declining for months, so her death wasn't unexpected, but it still hit our family hard. She had been living in her own home until the very end, stubbornly independent, and after the funeral, we had the enormous task of going through all of her belongings. My mother approached this task with the same controlling efficiency she brought to everything else. She wanted to handle most of it herself, sorting through decades of accumulated possessions with swift, decisive movements. She had already arranged for a donation truck to come the following week, and she seemed determined to have everything cleared out and sorted before then. Looking back, I realise now that she was in a hurry for a reason, that she knew there were things in that house that she didn't want me to find. But I insisted on helping. Grandmother had always been kind to me, in her quiet way, and going through, her things felt like a final way to honour her memory. My mother reluctantly agreed, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing at me as if she was afraid of what I might discover. We spent the better part of a Saturday going through closets and drawers, sorting items into piles for donation, trash and the few things we wanted to keep. My mother worked with mechanical precision, barely pausing to look at the items she was handling. It was as if she was trying to get through the process as quickly as possible, without allowing herself to be slowed down by sentiment or memory. Was working in the spare bedroom, going through a closet that seemed to be full of old linens and forgotten Christmas decorations when I found it. Pushed way back in the corner, behind boxes of ornaments and rolls of wrapping paper, was a small wooden box with my name written on the top in my grandmother's careful handwriting. Sarah, it said, in the same blue ink she had used to write me birthday cards every year. The moment I saw that box, something inside me went very still. There was no reason for my grandmother to have a box with my name on it hidden away in the back of a closet. If it was meant for me, why hadn't she given it to me while she was alive? Why was it hidden? My hands were trembling as I pulled it out from its hiding place, and I could hear my heart beating in my ears. I called out to my mother, telling her what I had found, and the speed with which she appeared in that doorway was startling. She moved faster than I had seen her move in years, and when she saw the box in my hands, her face went completely pale. For a moment, neither of us said anything. We just stood there, staring at each other across that cluttered bedroom, and I could feel the weight of 32 years of carefully guarded secrets pressing down on us. She reached for the box, movements quick and desperate, but I pulled it back instinctively. Something in her expression, some flash of panic that she couldn't quite hide, told me that whatever was in this box was important. More than important. It was dangerous, at least to the version of reality she had spent my entire life constructing. She tried to take it from me again, her voice taking on that cold, authoritative tone that had always made me back down as a child. She told me it was probably just old letters or photographs, nothing important, nothing worth keeping. She said we should just add it to the donation pile and move on, but her hands were shaking, and there was something in her eyes that I had never seen before. Fear. Raw, desperate fear. For the first time in my life, I didn't back down. I held that box against my chest and told her I wanted to see what was inside. She argued with me, her voice getting higher and more strained, but I could see that her usual tactics weren't working. The fear was making her sloppy, making her reveal more than she intended. This wasn't just about respecting my grandmother's belongings or being practical about what to keep. This was about something much bigger, much more dangerous to the carefully constructed world she had built around our family. I took the box home with me that night, despite her protests, despite her attempts to convince me that I was being disrespectful, to my grandmother's memory by going through her private things. But I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that this box was meant for me. My grandmother had written my name on it for a reason. She had hidden it for a reason. And my mother's desperate attempts to keep me from opening it only confirmed that whatever was inside would change everything. I sat in my living room for what felt like hours, just staring at that box. It was beautiful, made of dark wood with tiny brass hinges that had tarnished with age. The latch was simple but elegant, and when I ran my fingers over my name on the top, I could feel the slight indentations where my grandmother's pen had pressed into the wood. She had taken care with this, had wanted to make sure it reached me someday. When I finally worked up the courage to open it, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the latch. Inside, nestled in faded tissue paper, were several items that made no immediate sense to me. There were photographs, old ones with that distinctive colour saturation of film from the early 90s. There was a small teddy bear, obviously well loved, with one eye missing and fur that had been worn smooth in places from years of handling. There were several birthday cards, still in their envelopes, addressed to me but never opened. And at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of soft cloth, was a letter. The envelope was thick, cream-coloured paper that had yellowed slightly with age. Written across the front, in handwriting I didn't recognise, were the words, "For Sarah, when she's old." Enough to understand. The postmark was from 20 years ago, just a few months after my 12th birthday. My hands were trembling as I carefully opened the envelope, trying not to tear the old paper. The letter was written on matching stationery, several pages long, and as I unfolded it, I could see that it had been read many times. The creases were worn soft, and there were small stains on the paper that looked like they might have been tears. At the top of the first page, in that same careful handwriting, it said simply, "My dear daughter." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as I read those words. Daughter. Not dear Sarah or to Sarah, but my dear daughter. Written by someone whose handwriting I didn't recognise, someone who wasn't the man I had called Dad for 32 years. I had to read it 3 times before the words began to make sense, before I could process what I was seeing. The letter was from a man named David Richardson. He wrote that he was my biological father, that he had loved my mother deeply, but that their relationship had ended when I was 2 years old. He explained that my mother had made the decision to cut off all contact between us, that she had convinced him it would be better for everyone if he stayed away, if I grew up believing that Robert was my real father, He wrote about how much it had cost him to agree to this arrangement, how many nights he had lain awake wondering what I looked like, how I was doing in school, whether I was happy. But what broke my heart, what made me understand the true cruelty of what had been kept from me, were the details he included about our life together during those first 2 years. He wrote about how I had loved to be read to, how I would bring him the same book over and over again until he had memorized every word. He described the way I would fall asleep on his chest during afternoon naps, how I had this habit of twisting his hair around my tiny fingers when I was sleepy. He told me about my first steps, how I had walked straight into his arms in the kitchen of an apartment I had no memory of. He wrote about birthday parties and Christmas mornings and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that had been filled with love and laughter and all the small, precious moments that make up a childhood. All of this had been taken from me. All of these memories, this entire relationship, this part of my identity, had been erased as if it had never existed. The man who had sung me lullabies and taught me to ride a tricycle and loved me with his whole heart had been written out of my story so completely that I had never even known to miss him. He wrote about the letters he had sent over the years, birthday cards and Christmas presents that had apparently never reached me. He described driving by my school sometimes, just hoping to catch a glimpse of me, wondering if I would recognize him if we passed on the street. He told me about the college fund he had been contributing to, money that I later realized my mother had been accepting and using without ever telling me where it came from. The letter ended with an address and a phone number, along with a plea that nearly broke me. If you ever want to know your father, if you ever want to hear the stories your mother couldn't bring herself to tell you, I will be here. I have been waiting for you every day since the day you left, and I will keep waiting until my last breath. You were the light of my life for 2 precious years, and not a day has passed that I haven't wondered about the beautiful young woman you must have become. I love you, Sarah. I have never stopped loving you. I don't know how long I sat there, reading and rereading that letter, trying to process the magnitude of what I had discovered. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my family, about myself, had been a carefully constructed lie. The man I had called Dad for 32 years was not my father. The woman who had raised me had systematically erased my real father from my life, had stolen from me not just a relationship, but an entire part of my identity. I felt like I was drowning, like the ground had opened up beneath me, and I was falling through space with nothing to grab onto. Every memory I had of my childhood was now suspect. Every family photo, every birthday celebration, every conversation about where I came from, all of it was built on deception. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a stranger, someone whose story I didn't know, whose history had been stolen and replaced with fiction. The anger came in waves, each one stronger than the last. I was angry at my mother for the lies, for the systematic way she had erased David from my life. I was angry at the man I had called Dad for going along with it, for looking me in the eye every day and pretending to be something he wasn't. I was angry at my grandmother for keeping this secret, even though I understood now that she had probably been trying to protect me, waiting for the right time to reveal the truth. But mostly, I was angry at myself for never questioning more deeply, for accepting the gaps and inconsistencies, for being so eager to please that I had never demanded the truth. But underneath the anger was something even more devastating. Grief. I was grieving for the father I had never known I had, for the relationship that had been stolen from me, for the childhood that could have been so different if the truth had been allowed to exist. I was grieving for all the years that David had spent missing me, wondering about me, loving me from a distance. I was grieving for the version of myself that might have grown up knowing where she came from, secure in her identity, surrounded by love that didn't come with conditions and secrets. I called in sick to work the next day. I couldn't imagine sitting in meetings, pretending to care about marketing campaigns and quarterly reports when my entire world had been turned upside down. Instead, I spent the day walking around my apartment, like a caged animal, picking up the letter and putting it down again, staring at the photographs David had included, trying to find traces of myself in his face. There was one photograph in particular that I kept coming back to. It showed a man with kind eyes and greying hair, holding a toddler who was obviously me. We were both laughing at something outside the frame, and the joy on our faces was unmistakable. This was a father and daughter who loved each other deeply, who were comfortable and happy together. Looking at that photograph, I could almost remember the moment it was taken, could almost feel the echo of that happiness somewhere deep in my subconscious. I knew I had to confront my mother, but I dreaded it more than anything I had ever had to do. I knew she would deny it at first, would try to convince me that the letter was fake, or that David was lying, or that I was misunderstanding the situation. I knew she would use all the tactics she had perfected over the years to make me doubt my own perceptions, to make me feel guilty for questioning her, to make me back down and accept whatever version of reality she preferred. But I also knew that I couldn't live with this knowledge without confronting her. The letter had changed everything, had opened a door that could never be closed again. I had to know the whole truth, had to understand how and why this had happened, had to hear her explain how she had convinced herself that erasing my father from my life was the right thing to do. I drove to my childhood home on a rainy Thursday evening. The letter folded carefully in my purse, the photographs in an envelope beside it. My mother was in the kitchen when I arrived, preparing dinner with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. She looked up when I walked in, and I could see her taking in my appearance, noting the dark circles under my eyes, the way my hands were shaking slightly. She asked if I was feeling all right, her voice carrying that note of concern that always sounded slightly performative to me, as if she was playing the role of caring mother rather than actually feeling the emotion. I told her I needed to talk to her about something important, and I watched as her shoulders tensed, as her movements became more careful and controlled. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had done homework as a child, where we had eaten countless silent dinners, where I had learned to read her moods and adjust my behaviour accordingly. I pulled out the letter and placed it on the table between us, watching as her face went through a series of expressions: denial, fear, resignation, and finally, a kind of cold defiance. She didn't ask where I had found it. She didn't pretend not to know what it was. She just looked at me across that table and said, in a voice I had never heard her use before, "You weren't supposed to see that." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of my life. She didn't deny the contents of the letter, but she also didn't show any remorse for what she had done. Instead, she tried to justify it, to make me understand that she had been protecting me from a man she claimed was unreliable, irresponsible, incapable of being the kind of father I deserved. She painted a picture of David as someone who had abandoned us, who had chosen to walk away rather than take responsibility for his family. But even as she spoke, I could see the cracks in her story, could hear the way she was editing the truth, even as she claimed to be explaining it. She talked about how young I was, how I wouldn't have understood the complexities of adult relationships, how it was easier for everyone if I just accepted Robert as my father and moved on. When I asked her about the letters, the birthday cards, the money David had been sending, she became defensive, angry. She said she had been protecting me from false hopes, from a man who would only disappoint me in the end. She claimed that she had tried to give David chances to prove himself, but that he had always fallen short, had always chosen his own comfort over what was best for me. But I could see through the lies now, could hear the self-serving logic that had allowed her to convince herself that her actions were justified. She hadn't been protecting me from David. She had been protecting herself from having to share me, from having to acknowledge that she wasn't the only person who loved me, from having to deal with the complications of co-parenting with someone she was angry at. The man I had called Dad, Robert, came home in the middle of our conversation, and the look on his face when he saw the letter on the table told me everything I needed to know. He had known. He had known all along that I wasn't his biological daughter, and he had gone along with the deception for 30 years. When I looked at him with questions in my eyes, he couldn't meet my gaze. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen like a man, caught in a crime he had hoped would never be discovered. My mother turned to him then, and in that moment, I saw the dynamic that had shaped my entire childhood. She was the one who made the decisions, who controlled the narrative, who decided what was acceptable and what wasn't. He was the one who went along with it, who chose the path of least resistance, who sacrificed his own integrity to avoid conflict. They had both robbed me of my truth, but in different ways and for different reasons. I asked Robert directly if he had ever intended to tell me the truth, and the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. He started to speak several times but couldn't seem to find the words. Finally, he said that he had wanted to tell me, especially as I got older, but that my mother had convinced him it would be too disruptive, too confusing, too damaging to the family we had built together. But what family had we really built? What was our relationship based on, if not honesty, if not truth? I realised in that moment that I had never really known either of them, had never been allowed to know them as complete human beings with flaws and fears and complicated histories. They had both been playing roles, performing the parts of mother and father while keeping the most fundamental truth about our family locked away. I left that night without resolution, without apologies, without any of the closure I had hoped to find. My mother remained defiant, convinced that she had done what was best for everyone involved. Robert seemed broken by the conversation, but still unable or unwilling to fully acknowledge the harm that had been done. I drove home through the rain, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life, carrying the weight of 32 years of deception and the devastating knowledge that the people who were supposed to love me most had chosen lies over truth, control over connection. That night, I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to find David Richardson. I was going to call the number in the letter, despite the fact that it was 20 years old and might no longer be valid. I was going to try to reclaim the part of my story that had been stolen from me, to discover who I might have been if the truth had been allowed to exist. The next morning, I sat by my phone for 2 hours before I worked up the courage to dial the number. My hands were shaking so badly I had to redial twice, and when I finally heard it ringing on the other end, I thought I might pass out from anxiety. What if he didn't remember me? What if he had moved on, started a new family, built a life that didn't include space for the daughter who had been taken from him so many years ago? The voice that answered was deeper than I had expected, weathered by age but still warm. When I told him my name, there was a long silence, and then I heard something that sounded like a sob being held back. He said my name again, like he couldn't quite believe it was real, like he had been waiting so long to hear from me that he had almost given up hope. We talked for 3 hours that first day. He told me about his life, about the business he had built, about the small apartment where he lived alone, surrounded by photographs of a little girl who had been frozen in time at age 2. He had never married again, had never had other children. He said he had never been able to move on, had always held on to the hope that someday I would find my way back to him. He asked about my life, about school and work and relationships, and I found myself telling him things I had never told anyone. There was something about his voice, something familiar and comforting that made me feel safe in a way I hadn't experienced since childhood. It was as if some part of me recognized him, remembered him on a level deeper than conscious memory. We made plans to meet the following weekend, and the days leading up to it were a strange mixture of excitement and terror. I had no idea what to expect, how it would feel to be in the same room as this man who was biologically my father, but was essentially a stranger. I was afraid it would be awkward, that we wouldn't know how to talk to each other, that the years of separation would have created a gulf too wide to bridge. I drove to his apartment on a sunny Saturday morning, arriving 15 minutes early, and then sitting in my car for another 10 minutes, trying to work up the courage to knock on his door. When I finally did, he answered so quickly that I realised he must have been watching for me, probably as nervous as I was about this reunion. The man who opened the door was older than in the photographs, of course, but I could see traces of my own features in his face. We had the same green eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting our heads slightly when we were thinking. He was tall and slender, with greying hair and hands that looked like they had worked hard for many years. When he smiled at me, it was like looking into a mirror that showed me where I had come from. He invited me in, and I could see immediately that this was a man who had never stopped hoping I would return to his life. There were photographs of me everywhere, pictures from my school years that he must have gotten somehow, probably through my grandmother. There were birthday presents wrapped and stacked in a corner, gifts he had bought for me year after year, even though he had no way to give them to me. On his refrigerator was a collection of newspaper clippings, achievements and awards from my teenage years that someone, probably my grandmother again, had been sending him. We sat in his living room, drinking coffee and trying to figure out how to begin bridging 30 years of separation. He showed me photo albums from those first 2 years of my life, pictures that my mother had never shown me, moments that had been erased from my official family history. There I was, taking my first steps in his apartment. There I was on his shoulders at a park I didn't remember. There I was asleep in his arms, looking completely peaceful and secure. He told me stories about those years, filling in details that brought those photographs to life. He talked about the songs he used to sing to me, the games we used to play, the way I would help him make breakfast on Saturday mornings by standing on a chair next to the stove and stirring the eggs with a spoon that was too big for my small hands. He described the way I used to announce everything I was doing in my toddler voice, providing running commentary on my activities throughout the day. But he also told me about the pain of losing me, about the legal battles he had fought and lost, about the way my mother had gradually limited his access to me, until finally cutting it off completely. He explained that he had tried to fight it, had hired lawyers and filed petitions, but that the courts had sided with my mother, had decided that stability was more important than maintaining a relationship with a father who was portrayed as disruptive and unreliable. The picture he painted was very different from the one my mother had given me. In his version, he was a young man who had made mistakes, but who had loved me desperately, who had been willing to do whatever it took to remain part of my life. My mother, in his telling, was someone who had been hurt by their relationship and had decided to punish him by taking away the thing he loved most, me. I found myself believing his version not because I wanted to, but because it explained so many things that had never made sense before. It explained my mother's controlling nature, her need to manage every aspect of our family's narrative. It explained Robert's passivity, his willingness to go along with arrangements that must have felt uncomfortable even to him. It explained my own feeling of not quite fitting, of missing some essential piece of my identity. David and I spent the entire day together, talking and sharing stories, and trying to compress 30 years of separation into a few precious hours. When it was time for me to leave, neither of us wanted the conversation to end. We made plans to meet again the following week, and then the week after that. Slowly, carefully, we began to build a relationship based on the foundation of love that had never really disappeared, just been buried under years of separation and lies. But integrating David back into my life wasn't simple or easy. My relationship with my mother became increasingly strained as she realised that I was not going to pretend the letter had never existed, that I was not going to return to the comfortable lies that had shaped our family for so long. She felt betrayed by my decision to contact David, felt that I was choosing him over her, choosing the past over the present. Robert, meanwhile, seemed relieved that the secret was finally out, but also deeply uncomfortable with the new dynamic in our family. He had spent 30 years being my father, and now he had to figure out how to relate to me knowing that I knew the truth about our relationship. We had to rebuild our connection on more honest ground, acknowledging what we had meant to each other, while also recognising the foundation of deception that had shaped our bond. The process of getting to know David was wonderful and heartbreaking at the same time. Every story he told me, every memory he shared was a reminder of what I had lost, what had been taken from both of us. I found myself grieving not just for the relationship we hadn't had, but for the person I might have been if I had grown up, knowing the truth about where I came from. At the same time, I was discovering parts of myself that suddenly made sense. My love of music, which had never been shared by my mother or Robert, came from David, who played guitar and had apparently spent hours singing to me when I was small. My stubborn streak, which my mother had always criticised, was something I had inherited from him, along with his determination and his refusal to give up on the things that mattered to him. David introduced me to his side of the family, relatives I had never known existed, people who remembered me as a toddler and who had been wondering about me for 30 years. They welcomed me with open arms, sharing stories and photographs, and creating connections that felt both brand new and deeply familiar. I discovered that I had cousins, aunts and uncles, grandparents who had died never knowing what had happened to me, but who had loved me during those first 2 years of my life. But perhaps the most difficult part of this whole experience was learning to forgive. I had to find a way to forgive my mother for the lies, even though I still didn't fully understand how she had convinced herself that what she was doing was right. I had to forgive Robert for his passive complicity, for choosing the path of least resistance instead of fighting for the truth. I had to forgive my grandmother for keeping the secret, even though I understood that she had probably been trying to protect everyone involved. Most of all, I had to forgive myself for not asking more questions, for not pushing harder for answers, for being so eager to maintain peace that I had accepted a version of reality that never quite fit. I had to let go of the anger I felt at my own blindness, my own willingness to live with inconsistencies rather than demand the truth. The process is ongoing. It's been 6 months since I found that letter, and I'm still learning how to navigate relationships that have been fundamentally changed by the revelation of 30 years of deception. David and I talk every week now, sometimes more. We're slowly building the relationship that should have existed all along, but there's a sadness that underlies it, a recognition of all the time that was lost, all the moments that can never be recovered. My relationship with my mother remains complicated. She still doesn't fully acknowledge the harm that was done, still believes that her choices were justified. We're in therapy together, trying to find a way to move forward, but progress is slow. She's having to confront not just the impact of her decisions on me, but on David, on Robert, on herself. The lies she told became so much a part of her identity that giving them up feels like losing herself. Robert and I are doing better. He's been able to talk more openly about his feelings over the years, about his discomfort with the deception and his love for me that transcended biology. We've been able to acknowledge that while he wasn't my biological father, he was still the man who taught me to ride a bike, who helped me with homework, who was there for scraped knees and broken hearts. Our relationship is different now, more honest, but in some ways deeper, because it's built on choice rather than obligation. The hardest part of all of this has been learning to trust my own perceptions again. For 32 years, I lived in a reality that was carefully constructed by other people, where my questions were deflected and my instincts were dismissed. Learning to trust myself, to believe that my feelings and observations are valid, has been a daily practice. Sometimes I still catch myself second-guessing my own memories, wondering what else might not be true, what other secrets might be waiting to be discovered. But there's also been unexpected joy in this journey. Getting to know David has been like finding a missing piece of myself that I didn't even know was gone. We share so many mannerisms, so many ways of looking at the world, that being with him feels both completely new and strangely familiar. He tells me stories about his childhood, about his parents, about family traditions that I never knew existed. And suddenly I understand parts of myself that had always felt mysterious. He's shown me letters he wrote to me over the years, but never sent birthday wishes and Christmas greetings and updates about his life that he hoped someday I might want to read. Some of them are heartbreaking in their longing, their desperate hope that somehow I would find my way back to him. Others are angry, written during the years when he was fighting the legal system and losing, when he felt like he was being punished for crimes he hadn't committed. There's one letter in particular that I keep coming back to, written on my 16th birthday. In it, he wonders what kind of person I'm becoming, whether I'm happy, whether I ever think about the father I might have had. He writes about driving, past the high school where he thought I might be going, hoping to catch a glimpse of me, wondering if I would recognise him if we passed on the street. The longing in that letter is so raw, so honest, that reading it feels like looking directly into his heart. We've started doing things together now, creating new memories to add to the ones that were lost. He's teaching me to play guitar, the same instrument he used to play for me when I was small. My fingers are clumsy on the strings, and I'll never be as good as someone who started as a child. But there's something healing about sitting beside him, learning something he's passionate about, creating music together in the same room where he spent so many years missing me. He's also been helping me understand my family history, the stories that were edited out of my childhood. I learned that my great-grandmother on his side was an artist, that creativity runs in our family line, that my urge to write and create isn't random but inherited. I discovered that I have a great-uncle who served in World War II, that there are family stories of courage and sacrifice that I had never heard. All of these connections, these threads that link me to a larger story, had been severed when David was removed from my life. But perhaps the most powerful moment in our rebuilding relationship came about 3 months after we started meeting, regularly. We were looking through more old photographs, and he pulled out a small album that he said he hadn't been able to look at for years. It contained pictures from my second birthday party, the last celebration we had shared before everything fell apart. In the photos, I'm wearing a little pink dress that I don't remember, sitting in front of a cake shaped like a butterfly. David is kneeling beside me, helping me blow out the candles, and the joy on both our faces is unmistakable. But what struck me most was a photo taken later in the day, after the cake had been eaten and the presents opened. I'm asleep in David's arms, completely relaxed and trusting, while he looks down at me with an expression of such pure love that it takes my breath away. He told me that he used to look at that photograph when the pain of missing me became unbearable, that it reminded him of the love we had shared, the bond that couldn't be erased even by years of separation. He said he had always hoped that somewhere deep inside, I still carried the memory of being loved like that, completely and unconditionally. Looking at that photograph, something shifted inside me. I realised that while I couldn't remember the specific moment, I did carry something from those early years with David. That feeling of safety, of being cherished, had shaped me even when I didn't understand where it came from. It explained why I had always felt like something was missing, why I had searched my whole life for a kind of love that felt familiar, but that I couldn't name. The revelation about my true parentage has also changed how I understand my mother's behaviour over the years. Her controlling nature, her need to manage every detail of our family narrative, her fear of letting me get too close to certain people or ask too many questions, all of it makes sense now in a way it never did before. She wasn't just being overprotective, or controlling for the sake of control. She was protecting a secret that she believed would destroy our family if it ever came to light. I'm not excusing what she did. The systematic erasure of my father from my life was wrong, regardless of her motivations. But understanding her fear, her desperation to maintain the life she had built with Robert, has helped me begin to forgive her. She made a terrible choice, but it came from a place of love, even if it was a love that was twisted by fear and control. Our therapy sessions together have been difficult but illuminating. With the help of a counsellor, my mother has begun to acknowledge the harm her choices caused, not just to me and David, but to herself and Robert as well. She's starting to understand that the energy she spent maintaining lies could have been used to build genuine connections, that the control she thought she was exercising was actually a kind of prison that trapped all of us. She's also beginning to share her own story, the parts she had kept hidden even from herself. She talks about the fear she felt as a young mother, the overwhelming responsibility of raising a child, the way her relationship with David had become complicated and painful by the time it ended. She explains how Robert's stability and kindness had felt like salvation, but how accepting his help had come with the unspoken condition that David would be written out of our story entirely. What's emerged from these conversations is a picture of people making impossible choices in difficult circumstances, people who loved imperfectly, but who were trying to do their best with the emotional tools they had available. It doesn't excuse the lies or minimise the harm that was done, but it makes everyone involved more human, more understandable. Robert has been perhaps the most surprising in his willingness to examine his role in all of this. He's acknowledged that his passivity, his willingness to go along with arrangements he knew were wrong, was its own form of betrayal. He's talked about the times over the years when he wanted to tell me the truth, when he felt the weight of the deception becoming unbearable, but how he always chose the path of least resistance, the choice that avoided immediate conflict even if it caused long-term harm. He's also shared his own complicated feelings about being my father for 30 years. He genuinely loves me, has always loved me. But there was always an element of uncertainty in our relationship, a fear that someday the truth would come out and I would reject him for not being my real father. That fear, he realises now, kept him from being as close to me as he could have been, created a distance that didn't need to exist. What's beautiful about our relationship now is that we've been able to acknowledge that love doesn't require biology, that the bond we built over 30 years is real and valuable regardless of genetics. He may not be my biological father, but he's still the man who taught me to drive, who walked me down the aisle at my wedding, who was there for every important moment of my childhood and young adulthood. That relationship doesn't disappear because I've learned the truth about my origins. The integration of David into my life has also meant introducing him to my friends, my colleagues, the people who make up my adult world. Explaining the situation has been awkward and sometimes painful. How do you tell people that the family history you've shared for years was largely fictional? How do you introduce a man as your father when you've already talked about your father hundreds of times in ways that didn't include him? Some people have been incredibly supportive, understanding that families are complicated and that love can exist in many different forms. Others have been confused or judgmental, unable to understand how such a deception could have been maintained for so long. A few have made comments about how I should have known, should have asked more questions, should have figured it out sooner. Comments that echo my own self-criticism, but that sting nonetheless. But the people who matter most, the friends who really know me, have embraced David and have been excited to see me discovering this part of myself. They've noticed changes in me since I found that letter, a kind of settledness that wasn't there before, as if I'm finally comfortable in my own skin in a way I never was previously. David has also had to navigate the complexity of suddenly having an adult daughter in his life. He spent 30 years imagining what our relationship might be like, but the reality of getting to know me as a grown woman with my own life, my own opinions, my own problems, has been both wonderful and challenging. For him, we're not picking up where we left off when I was 2. We're building something entirely new. He's had to learn about my career, my interests, my way of seeing the world, all the things that parents usually discover gradually as their children grow up. Sometimes I can see him studying me, trying to figure out which parts of my personality come from him, which come from my mother, and which are uniquely my own. It's a strange kind of archaeology, digging through 30 years of development to find the traces of the child he once knew. There have been moments of profound connection, times when we'll be talking and suddenly we'll both stop, recognizing something familiar in each other's expressions or mannerisms. There have also been moments of sadness, when we're both acutely aware of all the time that was lost, all the experiences we should have shared but didn't. One of the most difficult aspects of this entire experience has been learning to live with ambiguity, with the fact that some questions will never be fully answered. I'll never know exactly what my life would have been like if David had remained part of it. I'll never know if my parents' marriage would have survived the complexity of co-parenting with my biological father. I'll never know if the person I became is fundamentally different from the person I would have been if I had grown up knowing the truth. What I do know is that the letter my grandmother left for me was a gift, even though opening it turned my world upside down. It gave me back a part of myself that I didn't even know was missing. It connected me to a history, a family, a sense of identity that had been stolen from me. It allowed me to understand myself in ways that had never been possible before. The truth hasn't made everything easier. In some ways, my life is more complicated now than it was when I was living in ignorance. I have more relationships to navigate, more family dynamics to understand, more history to integrate into my sense of self. But it's also more honest, more authentic, more aligned with who I really am. I think about that letter often, about my grandmother's decision to keep it for me, to wait until after her death to let me discover the truth. I understand now that she was probably protecting everyone involved, trying to find a way to preserve the family peace, while also ensuring that someday I would know where I came from. It was an act of love, even though it meant keeping a secret that must have been difficult for her to carry. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had never found that box, if my mother had succeeded in keeping it from me, if the secret had died with my grandmother. Would I have lived my entire life feeling like something was missing without ever knowing what it was? Would David have died alone, still hoping that someday I might find my way back to him? The thought of how close I came to never knowing the truth is both terrifying and heartbreaking, but I did find it, and now I'm living with the consequences of that discovery. Some days are harder than others. Some days I'm angry all over again about the time that was lost, the choices that were made without my input, the way my entire childhood was shaped by other people's fears and prejudices. Other days I'm grateful for the complexity, for the richness, that comes from having multiple father figures, multiple family histories, multiple ways of understanding where I come from. What I've learnt through all of this is that family is both more and less than we make it out to be. It's less because biology alone doesn't create love or loyalty or understanding. Robert will always be my father in the ways that matter most, regardless of genetics. But family is also more because it can expand to include people who were written out of the official story, people who loved us even when we didn't know they existed, people who waited years for the chance to be part of our lives again. I've also learned that truth is complicated, that the stories we tell ourselves about our lives are always incomplete, always filtered through the perspectives and fears and hopes of the people telling them. My mother's version of our family history wasn't entirely wrong, just as David's version isn't entirely right. The truth exists somewhere in between, in the messy complexity of human relationships and the impossible choices people make when they're trying to protect the people they love. As I sit here now, 6 months after, finding that letter, I'm still processing what it all means. I'm still learning how to be David's daughter, while also being Robert's daughter. I'm still figuring out how to forgive my mother, while also holding her accountable for the choices she made. I'm still discovering parts of myself that were hidden or suppressed, still integrating family histories that were kept from me for 32 years. But what I know for certain is that I'm more myself now than I ever was before. The letter didn't just give me back my father, it gave me back my truth. And living in truth, even when it's complicated and painful and messy, is infinitely better than living in the most carefully constructed lie. If you're listening to this, and you recognise something in my story, if you've ever felt like a stranger in your own family, if you've ever had the sense that something important was being kept from you, I want you to know that it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to push for answers, even when the people around you are uncomfortable. It's okay to insist on your right to know your own story. The truth might turn your world upside down, just like it did mine. It might force you to rebuild relationships you thought you understood, to forgive people you never thought you'd need to forgive, to grieve for versions of yourself and your family that never got to exist. But it will also set you free in ways you can't imagine until you experience them. Your story belongs to you. Your history, your identity, your understanding of where you come from and who you are. These things are yours by right. Don't let anyone convince you that ignorance is protection, that some truths are too dangerous to know, that maintaining other people's comfort is more important than your own authenticity. I found my truth in a letter hidden in a wooden box, but it might come to you in a different way. It might be a conversation overheard, a document discovered, a family member who finally decides to break their silence. However it comes, when it comes, be brave enough to face it. Be strong enough to ask the hard questions and demand the real answers, because at the end of the day, we all deserve to know who we are. We all deserve to understand our own stories. We all deserve to live in truth, even when that truth is more complicated than the fiction we've been living in. My name is Sarah, and this is my story. It's not the story I thought I was living 6 months ago, but it's my story nonetheless. It's messy and painful and beautiful and real, and it's mine. For the first time in my life, it's really, truly mine. And if there's someone out there who needs to hear this, someone who's been wondering about the gaps in their own family story, someone who's been told that some questions are better left unasked, I want you to know that your truth is waiting for you too. It might be hidden in a letter, or a photograph, or a conversation that's long overdue. But it's there, and you have the right to find it. Don't let anyone convince you that some lies are worth living. Don't let anyone convince you that your peace of mind is less important than their comfort. Don't let anyone convince you that your story doesn't belong to you. Find your truth. Face your truth. Live your truth. It will change everything, but it will also set you free.